So in the last video, we tried to look at the selection tool, but within the selection tool, there's a lot of different options. And so just to reiterate what I talked about, what I just said, is once you choose the selection tool, last video we discussed everything from here down, and we also discussed the whole list under modified, deform, and convert to. This is where we're going to start diving into these other tools. Okay, some of these are pretty straightforward and easy. Some of them have a lot of options. I'm going to do my best to explain the way I understand things, but there are resources out there if you want to dive in a little deeper. I already showed that to you last time. It's on Mesh Mixer's website. There's a link to their manual. The manual has all sorts of information on how each of these tools work. Like I said, some of them are pretty straightforward. I'm going to just, hold on, I'm going to go through here and select one ear just to show you what erase and fill does. So erase and fill does two things. It deletes the triangles that are selected, but instead of leaving a hole behind, it closes the hole. So it's doing two things. You could do those two things with two separate tools. You can do that with discard and then use the inspector to fill the hole, but erase and fill does them both. Okay, so if you look right here, erase and fill just erased the ear, but then tried to fill it in. Okay, notice that there's this little bulge here. You can change the setting here to a flat, and they call this one flat minimal. What they mean is the minimal amount of triangles. Leaves kind of a crude set of triangles. If you still want it flat, but you want better triangles, you can do the flat remeshed. And notice that you have a slider here that allows you to play around with how many triangles there are. Leaving it somewhere around there, maybe a little less than that, is going to be similar to what the model already has. Okay, or you use the smooth. Smooth has more options. It still has the same one here with refine, where notice what it's doing is it's changing the number of triangles in the resulting file. Smoothing on a scale like this isn't really going to do much. Let me hit defaults here. And then the scaling, notice what scaling is doing is it's causing it, to be honest, I don't know how to describe what's going on. Because it almost seems like it is just, doing less of the fill, like keeping it closer to what it used to be. I know that's not what it's actually doing, but it does let you play around a little bit, trying to get it where you want it to be. Bulge, my understanding on bulge is that, let me put the scaling factor up a little bit, is that it is causing the triangles to want to be further away from each other. And so it can bulge in both directions. Where this has become useful in dentistry is when you do an extraction of a tooth, you can use this to create a nice ovate pontic space. The option here to create a new group, let me show you what that means. If I hit accept right here and clear selection, see how this is still that gray color? I'm going to do Control Z a couple times to get back to here. If I say create new group and hit accept, it colors it, okay, with a face group. So let's go ahead and undo and hit cancel. Okay, right back where we started. That's the erase and fill option. Okay, discard is an easy one, just deletes them and leaves things alone. There's no options to mess around with. The keyboard shortcut, I don't know if you've noticed this yet, but keyboard shortcuts are always off to the side here. So the keyboard shortcut for discard is X, but also backspace and delete work. Reduce, I used to not use reduce because technically in the remesh you can also reduce. What I started realizing though is that remesh always goes back to the settings you used previously, and sometimes you use those settings to really take some triangles and reduce the number by quite a bit because you need more triangles to run a different tool. And then if you try to use the same exact tool next for a bigger piece of the, but for that one you don't want to reduce the number of, you don't want to increase the number of triangles, and you run the tool, it automatically jumps right in and you're sitting there forever waiting. And so reduce is nice because if your goal is to reduce the number of triangles, it's quick, okay? So going into the reduce, let me just recenter that a little bit. Going into the reduce, and I'm going to actually hit cancel, and let's grab a little bit bigger piece, okay? We'll get the whole head of this bunny here. All right, going into the reduce. So you can see a couple things. Right here in the reduce target, you've got a few options. Percentage means it's going to reduce the number of triangles by a percent. Triangle budget means you get to tell it how many triangles you want it to work with. And then max deviation. My understanding max deviation is that it's going to try to maintain the shape as best as it can. You can kind of see how well it's maintaining the shape even though I'm dragging this from side to side. Honestly, I never really use that one. I always stick to either percent or to the triangle budget, depending on, like, sometimes it just makes more sense to me to use the triangle budget because, you know, millimeters make more sense to me than a percent of something. And so, but they're essentially, they're doing almost the exact same thing, but you're just telling it different information. The percent, notice that if you're saying you want to reduce something, then increasing the percentage will reduce it further, okay? Whereas if you go the opposite direction, it kind of does nothing, actually. That's one thing I've noticed. If you drag it all the way over here, it almost looks just like the original. In the remesh, you'll notice that going one way reduces and one way does the opposite. So you get less triangles, more triangles. And so then if we switch it to triangle budget, notice this becomes grayed out, but the triangle count changes. So right now we've got 1,000 triangle option. If you increase that to 5,000, it doesn't go beyond the original, if you notice right there. But like if you're bringing it down, well, that's a little too extreme. No, at some point, let's try 50. Nope, 100. I'm not sure exactly how these calculations are because obviously that right there is more than 100 triangles. Or sorry, less than 100 triangles. So there's definitely something else going on that we're just not aware of. Maybe it means this is how many triangles. To be honest, I don't know. But bottom line is you can alter the number of triangles that it's using during the remesh. Let's go to this right here. So if you change these, so I'm going to go back to percentage. All right. Notice that with shape preserving, the triangles are all different shapes and sizes. But if you change it to uniform, see how now all the triangles are about the same length on the sides of the triangles. That is not normally what I do. Normally I leave it on shape preserving, and normally I either choose percent or I use triangle budget. Play around with these until I like how the mesh looks, and then I hit accept. These ones down here at the bottom, preserve boundary and preserve group boundary, that has to do with this area right here. So normally you'll want to leave that checked, because if you uncheck this and you hit accept, notice what it's done is that there's a lot of holes all the way around. That's going to be a mess, so just leave that one checked. And then the group boundary one, let me go back, preserve group boundaries. You wouldn't notice that unless we actually had some group. So we'll go ahead and make that into a face group, okay? And then we'll come back through and select those, and then we'll go back to our reduce. And notice that if I don't select that and I hit accept and I look at that, this has changed from what it was before. I'm going to go undo, undo, and now we're going to say preserve group boundary. See how there was a change right there? We hit accept, and now that is the same shape. The triangles may have changed, but it's the same shape. So it preserves that group boundary. That really comes down to why do you have that group, and does the shape of that group need to be preserved? So those are the different options for a reduce. There's more options when you come into the remesh, but it's going to look quite similar, okay? There's a lot of the same tools you'll notice, edge length. They don't say percent, they say density, but there's relative, adaptive, target edge length, and linear subdivision. My understanding is that relative density and target edge length is similar to the discussion we just had. They're doing the same thing, but one of it is by a percent and one of them is by specifying the length of the side of the triangle, whereas the other one was number of triangle. The adaptive density, according to the manual on meshmixer.com, it is supposedly able to better maintain the shape of the object that you're working on, okay? Whereas relative density apparently changes the shape. And so let's go the other way. Let's go over here, see if we can get it to show a difference. That's what it says, is that with adaptive, you're going to have a better chance of maintaining the shape. I've always left it on relative density, to be honest. I never use adaptive, but I use relative, target edge length, and linear subdivision depending on what I'm after. The other thing is that, let's see here. Let's put these on the defaults. Here we go. Relative. There we go. The regularity was all the way down, which was affecting our results. And so if you look at the difference here, relative density versus adaptive density, you can see that adaptive is maintaining the shape better, okay? Especially, let's see if we reduce it down to here and then switch between the two. Yeah, there we go. So notice that adaptive maintains the shape better than relative, but regularity has something to do with it. You know, the more you pull that regularity down, the more it maintains the shape. The more you move it up, the more it just really messes things up a bit. All right, so that's that. And then notice some of these things are grayed out, like right here where it says edge length. If you do that now, the edge length is something that you can play around with. And you can always, on these, you can always type in whatever number you want. If you want a millimeter, type in a millimeter. Linear subdivision, that is meant, this is probably a bad example of it, but that is meant to maintain shape, especially in situations where there's sharp edges. For example, let's come over here and drag a square onto the scene. So, or I should say a cube. So we've got this cube, and let's say here, let's do it like this. Let's say we've selected the corner of that cube right there, and we want to do a remesh, and let's say we have it on relative density. Notice on relative density that you've lost the sharpness, the corner of it, and even if you try to increase the amount of triangles, you've still lost that, okay? And well, I mean, that helps right there to check the preserve edge box, but you can just see a difference. See what's happening to all the different triangles in this one versus linear subdivision, where it's almost just cutting them up into smaller pieces, but keeping the original shape the same. Like, so see how this right here is a square, and this right here is a square. So linear subdivision takes the existing triangles and cuts them into pieces until they get smaller. And so sometimes that's what I want. Sometimes I'm happy with a relative density option. And then we just learned what preserve sharp edge is. And the sharp, I'm gonna delete this guy here, and we're gonna go back to our bunny. And let's grab the bunny's head again. All right, and R for remesh. So going back here to this discussion with remeshing, notice when I uncheck preserve sharp edges, you lose just a little bit of the detail around the bunny. And if we have it on, but we start messing around with the threshold, it does change how much it's calling a sharpness. So if you want to preserve as much as possible, you leave it all the way over at 0. And so let's see. Iterations is a concept that it's like I understand it, but I don't know how to explain it very well. So I'll try. But the idea is a lot of these tools run through a loop process where it does something and then it does it again and again and again. And each time it does it, it's moving it closer towards what the purpose of that tool is. And so if you want it to run through that calculation even more, you crank up the iterations. By default, I think that's on default right now. By default, it put it on 10, but if you want to crank it up, sometimes it makes a difference, sometimes it doesn't, because it's just, it's running through the same calculation. You'd probably notice more of a difference in some of these if you went the other way. Honestly, I don't play around too much with iterations. Last video, I mentioned that I use it on the smooth boundary tool because I've noticed it makes just the tiniest little bit of difference. So anyway, I already mentioned with the reduce, I used to always come to remesh because if I go up with this, it adds triangles, and if I went down, it takes them away. I could do both. I could reduce the amount, but I could add the amount. And I already talked about regularity. So, and then transition is talking about, like, let's say I crank this up all the way, okay? And I'm looking at this junction right here where it is coming right up to these. And here, I'll explain it. Sometimes these are more noticeable. If the triangle's out here, like here, for example, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do a reduce, and I'm going to make these triangles very large, okay? And then we're going to go back to our remesh, and if we try cranking this up all the way, see how like at the edges it's kind of doing a bit of stretching here and there. Maybe this isn't the best example. You can see actually the cube example we had was a better one. And maybe I'll go back to that in a second and show you what I mean. But if you take this transition and you start to drag it out, it changes what's going on in that. See how now it's starting with bigger triangles at the edge and then getting smaller, so it creates more of a transition between the two. I'm out of curiosity. I don't know if this is going to work because I haven't tested it yet, but out of curiosity, I noticed earlier that that it was doing this. But if we go into a remesh and we go into the linear subdivision and we crank it up, see this stuff here at the edges? I'm curious. Might not work with this particular tool. I'm just curious if we put the yeah, see, it did work. So you see how the transition is smoother around the edges because we gave it a better transition. That is a nice option because when it gets really junky here at the edges, it causes a lot of other problems. And so you want to just, be careful of that kind of stuff. So that's really all I wanted to talk about today, because that's a solid 30 minutes of discussion. So right now we just talked about these 4 right here: erase and fill, discard, reduce, and remesh. And so when we pick up again tomorrow, we'll just keep going down through this list. Some of these I don't use ever, like tube handle. I've never used tube handle, and I've never used fit primitive. But all the other ones we'll eventually cover. So hopefully that gives you something to play around with for the next couple days.